Hey guys, tonight we begin with a civilization that history has gotten spectacularly wrong. You've seen the helmets with horns that they never wore, heard about the savagery that was vastly exaggerated, and absorbed the myth of unwashed barbarians when the reality was exactly the opposite. The Vikings weren't just raiders and warriors, they were obsessive about daily rituals that governed everything from how they groomed their beards to how they negotiated with gods. And these routines reveal a society far more sophisticated than anything Hollywood has shown you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake before dawn in a longhouse that smells of smoke, wool, and last night's ale, and your first thought isn't about raiding or pillaging, it's about whether you remembered to sharpen your comb, because in Viking society, showing up to the morning meal with tangled hair is more shameful than showing up without your sword. Tonight, we're exploring the real daily rituals of the Norse people, the routines that defined their lives far more than any battle ever did. The longhouse is still dark when you open your eyes, just the faintest grey light seeping through the smoke hole above the central hearth. The fire has burned down to embers, glowing soft orange in the pre-dawn dimness. Around you, other members of the household are beginning to stir on their sleeping benches, the rustle of wool blankets and the creak of wood joining the sound of your own breathing. The air is cold enough that you can see your breath, but not so cold that the water basin near the entrance will have frozen. That's important, because what happens next is not optional. You swing your legs off the bench, feet finding the packed earth floor, and make your way to the basin. The ritual of morning washing is so ingrained that you perform it without thinking. Even though the water is cold enough to make your fingers ache, you splash it over your face, scrub your hands, work it through your beard if you're a man, or over your scalp if you're a woman about to rebraid your hair for the day. This isn't vanity, though an Arab traveller named Ibn Fadlan who visited your distant cousins in the east seemed to think so when he watched a group of Rus Vikings share a morning wash basin, each person washing face and hair, blowing their nose and spitting into the same water before passing it along. He called you the filthiest creatures he'd ever seen, which is darkly funny because his complaint wasn't that Vikings don't wash. It was that they don't wash the way he does, with fresh running water for each person in the Islamic tradition of ritual purity. To his eyes, till communal water is disgusting. To your eyes, it's practical and sufficient, and the fact that you're washing at all puts you ahead of most Europeans who will live centuries after you're gone. The real grooming begins after the initial wash, and this is where the stereotype of the filthy Viking crumbles entirely. You reach for your comb, and this object alone tells a story that contradicts everything popular culture has taught about your people. It's made from antler, carved with intricate patterns that catch what little light there is. And it lives in a protective case you carry on your belt like other people carry knives. Because in your world, the comb is nearly as important as the knife. You've seen combs in virtually every grave your people have dug, placed alongside the dead like they're necessary for the journey to whatever comes next. Rich or poor, warrior or craftsman, everyone owns a comb, everyone uses it daily. And the quality of your comb announces your status as clearly as the quality of your sword. You work it through your hair, slowly, methodically, feeling for the tangles and the unwelcome passengers that inevitably try to make homes in human scalp. Lice and their eggs must be removed, not just because they itch, but because letting them flourish marks you as someone who doesn't take care of themselves. Someone not worth respecting. If you're a man, you move next to your beard, combing it into some semblance of order, perhaps trimming any strays with a small knife or scissors if you have them. Some men you know have taken to bleaching their beards, mixing lye from wood ash and applying it until the hair turns a striking yellow gold. It's dramatic, memorable, and according to the same Ibn Fadlan who complained about shared wash basins, it makes you look bizarre, but you're not doing it for him. If you're a woman, your hair is a more complex matter, tied directly to your legal status in ways men's never is. Unmarried girls can wear their hair long and loose or bound with ribbons, the freedom of their hair reflecting the freedom of their unattached state. But once you marry, that changes. Your hair goes up, pinned or braided and wrapped, often covered with a linen cap or silk if you can afford it. It's a visible marker that you belong to a household now, that you're no longer in the marriage market. The change is so fundamental that it's part of the wedding ceremony itself. When your new husband removes your maiden's hair ribbon and helps you pin up your hair for the first time as a married woman, and if you're a slave, male or female, your hair is cut short by force, another visible marker of status, but this time of the lowest kind. In a society where free people pride themselves on long, well-maintained hair, being shorn is a humiliation that announces your lack of rights to everyone who sees you. The grooming tools scattered around the longhouse tell their own story. Tweezers for plucking unwanted facial hair, razor blades for shaving necks or cheeks, even small scoops designed specifically for cleaning ears, all found in archaeological digs across the Norse world. These aren't the possessions of a people who don't care about hygiene. These are the tools of a culture that understands cleanliness is power, that appearance matters, that showing up unkempt is showing up unprepared for social combat. Because that's what every day is in Viking society, a series of social interactions where you're being judged, measured, evaluated. And the first thing people notice is whether you bother to drag a comb through your hair. By the time the sun actually rises, you're presentable, which means you're ready for the day's work, whatever that might be. But there's one ritual you're already thinking about, one that won't come until the end of the week, but that shapes how you think about time itself. Saturday. Lugardagur in your language. Washing day. The day you actually bathe. This is where the gulf between historical reality and modern assumption becomes a chasm. Popular imagination puts medieval people, Vikings included, in a state of permanent filth, unwashed from one year to the next. But you bathe every Saturday without fail and have done so your entire life. It's so fundamental to Norse culture that the day itself is named for the activity. While much of Christian Europe will spend the coming centuries debating whether frequent bathing is sinful, whether washing away the holy grime of suffering brings you closer to or further from God, you and your people have already settled the question. Bathing is good, it's necessary, it's a marker of civilization. The methods vary depending on where you live. If you're in the cold regions of Norway or Sweden, your household or community has built something like a sauna, a small structure with stones that can be heated until they glow, then splashed with water to create steam. You sit in that steam until sweat pours from every pore, until the heat has done its work. Then you rush outside and plunge into the nearest cold stream or snowbank. The shock of temperature is supposed to be healthy, invigorating, cleansing in a way that goes beyond merely removing dirt. If you're in Iceland, you're luckier in some ways because the island provides its own heating. Hot springs bubble up from the volcanic earth, and clever engineering has brought that water into dedicated bathing houses where you can soak for as long as you like without having to build a fire first. And in summer everywhere, lakes and streams are used freely. The cold water less of a shock when the air itself is warm. You make your own soap or buy it from someone who does, rendered from animal fat and wood ash in a process that creates a lye-based cleanser, strong enough to strip grease and dirt but harsh enough that you have to be careful with it. The soap doesn't smell pleasant by modern standards. No perfumes or essential oils, just the slightly acrid scent of its chemical components doing their job. But it works, and working is what matters. Some of the wealthier households have access to imported soap from further south, made with olive oil instead of animal fat, gentler and more expensive. Another way to display status through the most mundane of activities. This commitment to cleanliness has consequences you might not expect. There's a monk in England named John of Wallingford who's absolutely furious about it. He writes, seething with barely controlled rage, that Vikings bathe every Saturday, comb their hair daily, and change their clothes regularly. And this makes them dangerously attractive to English women. In his telling, respectable Anglo-Saxon ladies are running off with Norse raiders not because they're being kidnapped, but because the raiders smell better than Englishmen. The Vikings' crime isn't violence in this complaint, it's superior hygiene. They're too clean, too well groomed, too appealing. and it's causing social chaos in English villages where women apparently have standards. The contradiction between John of Wallingford's complaint and Ibn Fadlan's disgust points to something important about how historical evidence works. Both men are observing the same culture and coming to opposite conclusions about cleanliness. The difference isn't that one is lying or stupid, it's that they're each judging Vikings by the standards of their own societies. To the Muslim diplomat from a culture with ritual purity laws requiring frequent washing and clean water, shared morning basins are repellent even if they're used daily. To the Christian monk from a culture where bathing is suspect and infrequent, weekly baths and daily grooming are excessive vanity. The Vikings, sitting in the middle, are cleaner than their European contemporaries and dirtier than their Islamic observers, and both groups are appalled for opposite reasons. What this tells us is that Viking hygiene existed in its own context, developed for its own reasons, and that trying to judge it by modern standards or foreign contemporaries both miss the point. The Vikings wash because washing works, because it prevents disease, because it maintains social standing, because it's what their culture has decided civilized people do. The morning grooming complete and the week's bath anticipated, you move into the other rhythms of life, and here the daily routine gives way to something larger and more complex, because while you wash your face every morning and comb your hair before witnesses, there are other rituals that structure time on longer scales. Rituals that connect you not just to your household or village, but to the gods themselves and to the turning of the seasons. These are the blot ceremonies, and they're where the real power of Viking ritual becomes visible. 3 times a year, sometimes 4. The entire community gathers for something that's simultaneously a religious ceremony, a political assembly, a feast, and a barely controlled drunk. The blot is all of these things, and trying to separate them misses the point of how Viking society actually functions. Religion, politics, and social hierarchy are not separate spheres. They're the same thing approached from different angles, and the blot is where all those angles converge in a single event that can last for days. The timing follows the agricultural year because that's what matters when you live by farming. There's a winter solstice blot as the year turns and the darkest days begin their slow retreat towards spring. There's a spring blot at planting time when you need the gods' favour for crops. There's a summer blot around the solstice when raids and trading voyages begin in earnest. And there's an autumn blot at harvest when you give thanks for what grew and prepare for the lean months ahead. These aren't arbitrary dates chosen by priests. They're the natural rhythm of a northern climate where success or failure in farming means survival or starvation, where the gods who control weather and fertility aren't abstract theological concepts but practical necessities. You'd better stay on good terms with. The ceremony itself has evolved over the centuries you've been performing it. Your grandparents might have gathered in sacred groves, outdoor spaces marked as holy through tradition and local belief. But increasingly, the blot takes place in the hall of whoever is powerful enough to host it, usually the local chieftain or wealthiest landowner. This shift isn't accidental. It's a calculated move by the ambitious and clever, because hosting a blot means controlling access to the gods, and controlling access to the gods means political power. If everyone has to come to your hall to participate in the ritual, if you're the one providing the animals to sacrifice and the meat for the feast afterward, if the gods seem to favour your household with success and prosperity, then you're not just rich and powerful, you're necessary. You're the intermediary between your community and the forces that determine whether children are born healthy, whether crops grow tall, whether warriors come home from battle. That's power that no amount of silver can buy, but that successful blot can establish. The sacrifice itself is precise, almost surgical in its execution. An animal is selected, a horse or bull if the occasion is important and the host wealthy, a pig if resources are more limited. The animal must be without flaw, healthy and strong, because offering a diseased or weak creature to the gods is insulting and dangerous, likely to bring the opposite of the favour you're seeking. The killing is done by someone who knows what they're doing, a quick strike that drops the animal as cleanly as possible, and immediately the blood is collected in a bowl. Every drop precious, because blood is the currency of this transaction. Blood, hlort in your language, is what the gods want, what they accept as payment for their intervention in mortal affairs. The blood is applied systematically, almost bureaucratically. A small branch, often evergreen, is dipped into the bowl and used to sprinkle the altar first, the wooden structure that serves as the god's seat in this space. Then the walls of the hall are sprinkled, marking the building itself as sacred space for the duration of the ceremony. And then the participants themselves, everyone who has come to take part, hold still while drops of warm blood are flicked onto their faces and clothes. This is the moment of connection, the physical marking that says you're part of this exchange. You're in the contract now. You've paid your share and you're entitled to request your share of divine favour in return. There's no squeamishness about the blood, no one flinching away from it. This is how you talk to gods when you can't speak their language, through the most powerful symbol of life that exists, freely given so that more life might flow back to you in the form of good harvests and surviving children and victories in the dozen small conflicts that make up Norse life. Once the blood ritual is complete, the practical part begins. And this is where the blot transforms from religious ceremony into something that looks more like a harvest festival or a wedding reception. The sacrificed animal is butchered efficiently, the meat portioned out according to social rank, and massive cauldrons are set up to cook it. The entire community is going to eat this meat, and the eating matters as much as the sacrifice, sharing food from the same animal, especially food that's been offered to the gods first, creates bonds of obligation and community that transcend individual relationships. You're all eating the same thing, blessed by the same ritual, as connected through consumption, in a way that makes future betrayal harder to justify. It's social engineering disguised as dinner. The drinking that accompanies the meal is its own ritual, structured and formal despite the eventual drunkenness that becomes almost inevitable. Horns are filled with mead or ale, not casual mugs but ceremonial drinking vessels that are often decorated, sometimes covered in elaborate carvings or inlaid with metal. The person hosting the blot, usually the chieftain in whose hall you're gathered, begins the toasts. First to the gods, to Odin for wisdom in the coming season, to Thor for protection from chaos and enemies, to Freya for fertility in fields and families. Each toast is drunk fully, the horn drained in a single session if possible, and as the liquid goes down, prayers and wishes go up. Then toast to ancestors, the remembered dead whose names are spoken aloud so their luck and strength might be invoked for the living. And finally toast to the living great, to the chieftain himself, to successful farmers or warriors, to anyone whose prestige needs acknowledging. These toasts are not casual compliments. They're public records of social standing, announcements of who matters, spoken in front of witnesses so that no one can later claim their status was different than what was recognised here. As the night wears on, and the mead does its work, the atmosphere shifts from formal ceremony to something looser and more dangerous. Men begin making boasts, public declarations of what they intend to accomplish in the coming season. I will sail to Francia and return with silver. I will clear the Northfield and plant it in barley. I will resolve the feud with a family 3 valleys over without bloodshed. These boasts are binding in a way that casual promises are not. They're made before the gods and the community, witnessed and remembered, and failure to achieve them means shame that can last generations. Some men, drunk on mead and moment, boast things they have no hope of achieving, and they'll spend the next year either performing miracles or becoming jokes. The blot creates obligations, and obligations create structure. And structure is what keeps a decentralized society like yours from flying apart into individual family units with no connection or shared purpose. But underneath all the ceremony and feast, underneath the prayers and toasts and boasts, there's a political reality that everyone understands, even if no one says it directly. The chieftain hosting this blot is demonstrating his wealth and power in the most concrete terms possible. He's provided the animal for sacrifice, probably several animals over the course of the feast. He's provided the mead and ale that everyone is drinking, supplies that represent months of production and storage. He's opened his hall to the entire free population of the area, feeding them for days, housing some of them overnight, displaying hospitality on a scale that most families couldn't manage for a single unexpected guest. And in doing all this, he's making a wordless argument that he deserves to remain chieftain, that his household prospers under the god's favour, that supporting him is supporting a winning team. Political loyalty in Viking society isn't bought with speeches or manifestos. It's bought with meat and mead and the demonstration that you know how to keep the gods happy. If the harvests are good after a chieftain's blaught, his position strengthens. If they're poor, people start wondering if maybe the gods would prefer someone else in that hall, hosting those ceremonies. This is where religion and politics become completely inseparable. The chieftain isn't just a secular leader who happens to host religious ceremonies. He's a religious figure who exercises political power as a consequence of his relationship with the divine. The hall where you're feasting isn't just a house that's big enough to hold everyone. It's becoming a temple, a sacred space where the community comes to interface with powers larger than themselves. As Christianity begins to creep into Norse lands in the centuries after your time, it will partially succeed by co-opting exactly this structure. Christian chiefs will host feasts in their halls, but instead of blot, they'll call it Mass. Instead of Thor and Odin, they'll be toasting Christ and the saints. But the fundamental dynamic of power through religious hospitality will remain exactly the same. The Vikings will understand this transition instinctively because the form is what matters. The content of which gods you're honouring is almost secondary to the social function of honouring them together. Not all ritual interaction with the divine happens in the structured formality of blot, though. There are other, stranger practices that sit uncomfortably next to the communal feasts. Practices that are more individual, more mysterious, and that carry a whiff of danger or transgression that blot never quite manages. This is the realm of Seder, of magic, and of the women called Völva who walk through your world with a status that's simultaneously revered and slightly shameful. Seder is difficult to translate, difficult even to describe, because it occupies a space in Viking worldview that doesn't quite map onto modern categories. It's magic, but it's not the flashy, destructive magic of fantasy stories. It's the ability to see fate, to know what's coming, to shape outcomes through means that aren't entirely clear even to the people practicing it. And crucially, in a warrior society that prizes masculine violence and direct confrontation, Seder is women's work. Men can practice it. There are stories of men who do, but it's considered unmanly, vaguely embarrassing, the kind of thing that makes other men wonder about you. Even Odin, the chief of the gods, practiced Seder according to the myths, and even he got mocked for it, accused of being ergi, a word that means unmanly or effeminate, and that carries connotations of sexual passivity, that make it one of the worst insults you can throw. So Seder exists in this strange space where it's powerful and respected and also sort of shameful, where the women who practice it are sought out for their abilities, but also kept at arm's length. Necessary but unsettling. The Völva travels between communities, a professional seer who goes where she's needed and stays as long as her services are required. When she arrives, it's an event. She's dressed distinctly, wearing clothes that mark her as different, and she carries a staff, the Völvandistaffar. That's both a walking stick and a symbol of her authority. These staffs show up in archaeological excavations, found in women's graves alongside other goods, and they're one of the few pieces of physical evidence we have that Völva existed outside of saga texts. The Völva's arrival means a community has questions that need answering, or problems that require solutions outside the normal channels. Will the harvest be good this year? Should we send our ships to Iceland or to England? Is the sickness that's killing our cattle natural, or is someone cursing us? These aren't idle curiosities. They're life or death decisions dressed up as fortune-telling. And the Völva's answers will shape what an entire village does for the next season or year. The ceremony she performs is theatrical, deliberately so. A special platform is built for her to sit on, raised above the audience, and she settles onto it with her staff and her tools and begins to chant. What she chants is often unclear in the sources, possibly because it was considered too sacred to record, possibly because the saga writers who came later didn't entirely understand what they were documenting. But the chanting continues, building in intensity, and the Völva enters what appears to be a trance state, her consciousness travelling to wherever it is that fate lives, consulting with powers or patterns that regular people can't access. When she comes back, she speaks, and everyone listens, because this is as close as you get to certainty about the future. and certainty is worth whatever you've paid her in food or silver, or the goat you'll give her when she leaves. Not all magic requires a professional. Runes, the alphabet your people use for writing, also serve magical purposes, and this is a kind of magic that's more democratic, available to anyone who knows which symbols do what. You carve runes onto weapons for victory in battle, onto ships for safe passage, onto doorways for protection of the household. The runes themselves aren't spells exactly. They're more like condensed wishes, prayers carved into physical form. A sword might carry a simple message. This brings victory. A ship-safe journey. A doorway. No harm enters here. It's not elaborate. Not the complex rituals of grimoires from later centuries, just a straightforward acknowledgement that words have power. Symbols have power, and carving them into the things you care about offers some measure of control in an uncontrollable world. Then there are the practical rituals that blur the line between magic and technology so thoroughly that trying to separate them becomes pointless. When you're preparing for battle, you might file grooves into your front teeth, parallel lines carved into the enamel that catch the light and make you look more fearsome when you snarl. Is this magic, or is this practical intimidation? The answer is yes. Before a long journey, you prepare touchwood, a mushroom soaked in your own urine until it becomes a felt-like material that will smoulder for hours without flame, allowing you to carry fire with you safely. Is this ritual, or is this technology? Again, yes. The distinction your culture makes between these categories is nothing like the hardline modern thinking draws. Everything practical has spiritual implications, everything spiritual has practical applications. And trying to pass which is which misses the point of how you actually experience the world. Nowhere is this clearer than in the forging of swords, where ritual and metallurgy combine to produce weapons that are genuinely superior to what your enemies carry. Even though the process looks like pure superstition, when a blacksmith makes a sword, he burns bones in his forge. Specifically, he burns the bones of ancestors, dead family members whose remains have been kept for exactly this purpose, along with bones from sacrificial animals offered to the gods. He mixes the ash from these bones with the iron ore he's smelting, believing that the strength and luck of the dead will transfer into the metal, that the sword will carry the power of all those lives into battle. From a modern metallurgical perspective, what he's doing is adding carbon to iron, carburizing the surface layer and creating a form of crude steel that's harder and holds an edge better than pure iron ever could. But he doesn't know that's what he's doing. He knows that swords made with bone ash are better, that they're lucky, that warriors who carry them come home. The ritual explanation and the chemical explanation are both true. They're just true in different languages. And the Viking blacksmith gets the results he wants without needing the chemistry lesson. This matters more than it might seem at first. The Vikings have access to bog iron, a low-quality ore that's soft and doesn't take a good edge. Without the ritual of bone ash, their weapons would be inferior to the steelwork coming out of the Middle East, or even out of later European forges. But with it, Viking swords become valuable trade goods, weapons that other people want to buy or capture, arms that give their carriers a real advantage in combat. A ritual performed for magical reasons produces a technological edge, and that edge translates directly into survival rates and military success. The line between magic and technology isn't just blurry in Viking thought, it's non-existent, and that actually works better than trying to keep them separate. The rituals that structure years and connect you to gods are important, but there are other rituals that structure individual lives, marking the transition points that turn a biological creature into a social person. And the first of these comes shockingly soon after birth, when you exist in a strange legal limbo where you're alive but not quite human yet. When a child is born, usually at home with the help of women who've done this before, the baby is immediately brought to the father. This moment is critical, far more critical than the actual delivery, because what happens next determines whether the child lives. The father examines the baby, checking for obvious deformities or signs of weakness, considering whether the household can afford another mouth to feed, evaluating factors that are never written down but that everyone understands. Then he makes a choice. He either places the child on his knee, a gesture that accepts the baby into the family and gives it legal personhood, Or he doesn't. If he doesn't, the baby's taken away and exposed, left outside to die of cold or be taken by animals or possibly to be found and raised by someone else with more resources or fewer children. This sounds barbaric to modern ears, and it is by modern standards, but by the standards of Viking-era Scandinavia, where childhood mortality is crushingly high and resources are desperately limited, and giving birth is one of the most dangerous things a woman can do. It's a hard practical calculation. Not every baby born can survive to adulthood. Not every pregnancy results in a viable child. And it's better to make the choice quickly than to invest years of food and care into a child who will die anyway. If the father accepts the baby, placing it on his knee in front of witnesses, a clock starts ticking. 9 days. For 9 days the baby exists in a strange state. Legally alive, but spiritually incomplete. A person, but not quite a full member of the community. And then on the 9th day comes the naming ceremony. Auham Vadni, the sprinkling of water. And this is where the transformation completes. Water is dripped onto the baby's head. Not a full bath, but a ritual marking, and the child's name is announced publicly for the first time. The name matters enormously because Vikings practice something called name magic. The belief that giving a child the name of a dead ancestor will transfer that person's luck, courage, skills, and character to the new baby. So children are often named for grandparents or respected relatives who've died. And the choice of name is a statement about what qualities the family hopes to see develop. A boy named for a successful trader is being pointed toward commerce. A girl named for a grandmother who lived to great age is being blessed with longevity. The name is a prayer and a prediction. But there's another reason the naming ceremony matters, one that's grimly legal rather than spiritual. After a baby has been named, killing it is murder. Before the naming, if the baby dies, it's tragic, but it's not a crime. There's a bright line, and that line is the 9th day and the water and the name. This creates a strange grace period where families can reconsider if they've made a mistake, if the baby proves weaker than expected, if circumstances change. But once the name is given and the water sprinkled, that window closes. The child is protected by law. Killing them would require a trial and punishment, and they're officially counted as a member of the household with all the rights and obligations that brings. A ritual that looks superficially like Christian baptism is actually doing something completely different, transforming a biological fact into a legal person through witness ceremony. The next major ritual transition doesn't come at a specific age, because Viking society doesn't think about maturity that way. 13-year-olds in modern terms might still be children, but a 13-year-old who can manage a farm or fight effectively or navigate a ship is an adult by Viking standards. And that's what matters. Adulthood is a threshold you cross by demonstrating capability, and the ritual that marks the crossing is tied to gender in ways that are absolute and unquestioned. For boys, the ritual is simple and clear. When you've learned to fight, when your father or uncle or chieftain judges that you can hold a shield wall or board a ship without being a liability, you're given your first weapon. Not a practice sword, not a wooden toy, but a real blade with your name on it. Or more likely without your name yet, because you haven't earned the right to have a named sword. This is your coming-of-age ceremony. The weapon is presented formally, often at a feast where witnesses can see it happen. And from that moment you're a man with a man's responsibilities. You can own properties, you can speak at thing, you can be called to war. You can marry. The sword or axe or spear is the hinge point, the thing that opens the door to adult life. And every boy knows it's coming and spends years preparing for it, because failing to be ready would be a shame that follows you forever. For girls, the transition is different but no less absolute. You become an adult when you can run a household, and you prove you can run a household by getting married. This usually happens young, often around 12 or 13, occasionally even younger. And it's not because Viking culture is trying to be cruel, but because households need managing, and children need bearing and waiting until modern ideas of maturity would mean wasting years when you could be establishing a family line. The marriage itself is a ritual so laden with symbolism that unpacking all of it would take hours. But the core elements are these: your family and his family negotiate terms, exchanging property, weapons, and legal promises. On the wedding day, you participate in a bride race, a ritual run that probably started as wife capture reenactment, but that's now purely symbolic, meant to show that you're physically capable of the work ahead. Swords are exchanged between the families, his family giving one to yours and vice versa, because marriages in Viking society are always alliances, always connections between clans that might need to fight together or trade together or simply avoid fighting each other. And at some point in the ceremony, a Thor's hammer is placed in your lap, a prayer for fertility made manifest. Because children are the point of marriage in a culture where high childhood mortality means you need to have many children if you want any to survive to adulthood. Once married, your legal status changes completely. You can own property independently of your father. You can initiate divorce, and the grounds for divorce are surprisingly broad cruelty, public insults, cross-dressing, whatever, really, as long as you can make the case before witnesses. Your husband is required by law to negotiate with you, not command you, on major household decisions. None of this makes Viking women equal to men in modern terms, but it makes them far more equal than women in most contemporary cultures. And that's because the household is an economic unit that needs two functional partners, not a hierarchy where one person owns the other. If you're dead or unable to contribute, the farm fails. If he's dead or unable to contribute, the farm fails. Marriage is a partnership enforced by survival necessity, and the ritual that creates it acknowledges this by binding two families together, not just two individuals. The final life cycle ritual is the one no one performs for themselves, but that everyone receives if they die at home rather than in battle or at sea. When you die, if your family has the resources, you're given a funeral that's equal parts grief, politics, and property management. And the centerpiece is a feast that happens after you're buried or burned. A gathering called Erfi that's as much about the living as the dead. Preparation of your body is careful, detailed, respectful. You're washed one final time, dressed in your best clothes or possibly new clothes made specifically for this purpose, and arranged with the possessions that defined your life. If you were a craftsman, your tools go with you. If you were a warrior, your weapons. If you were wealthy, jewellery and coins and fine cloth. The logic is that you'll need these things wherever you're going. That the afterlife has use for combs and knives and drinking horns. Or at least that the journey there requires supplies. But there's another layer too. The quality and quantity of your grave goods announces your status to the living. The people who will walk away from your burial and remember you by what was worth burying. A rich burial means you mattered. A poor one means you didn't. It's that simple and that cruel. The disposal of the body itself varies. Cremation is most common. The body placed on a pyre with its goods and burned until nothing remains but ash and bone fragments, which are then collected and sometimes buried under a mound of earth. The smoke rising is thought to carry the soul upward, releasing it from the body so it can travel to whatever afterlife awaits. But some people, particularly wealthy or important people, are buried in ships, actual boats placed in the ground or under mounds with the body and goods arranged inside. These ship burials are expensive, elaborate, and rare enough that they make international headlines when archaeologists find them centuries later. The Oseberg ship, the Gokstad ship, spectacular wooden vessels with their occupants and everything they owned, sealed in earth and preserved by accident of chemistry, waiting to be rediscovered and excavated and turned into museum centerpieces that will draw crowds centuries after you're gone. But the burial itself, spectacular as it might be, is only half the ritual. The other half happens after, when the grief is fresh but the body is gone and there's business to be done. This is the Erfi, the funeral feast, and it serves purposes that have nothing to do with honouring the dead and everything to do with managing the living. The Erfi can happen immediately after burial or weeks later, depending on how long it takes to gather everyone who needs to be there. And everyone does need to be there, because what's about to happen is essentially a public reading of the will combined with the transfer of power ceremony, all wrapped in the social acceptability of getting drunk together. The deceased's hall, or the hall of whoever is hosting if the deceased didn't have one grand enough, fills with relatives, neighbours, allies, people who are owed debts and people who owe them. The seating arrangements matter intensely, reflecting and reinforcing who has claims to what, Who's important enough to sit close to the high seat? Who's peripheral enough to be near the door? Food and drink flow with calculated generosity, because the heir who's going to inherit everything needs to demonstrate immediately that they can afford to be generous, that the household will continue functioning, that relationships will be honoured. Mead and ale are poured liberally, toasts are drunk to the memory of the dead, stories are told about their life, their accomplishments, their failures, their quirks. This storytelling isn't just sentiment, it's evidence being entered into public record, witnesses confirming or disputing what kind of person died, and therefore what kind of inheritance they leave behind. Both material and reputational. At some point in the feast, usually after enough drinking has loosened tongues, but before so much drinking has made people incoherent, the formal business begins. The heir, usually the eldest son but not always, stands and announces the inheritance. Land goes to this son, livestock to that daughter. Weapons and tools are distributed. Debts are acknowledged and either settled or transferred. This is done publicly, with witnesses, specifically to prevent future disputes. Everyone in that hall hears who got what. Everyone can confirm or challenge the distribution, and once it's done and witnessed, it's done. Fighting about it later means challenging the testimony of everyone present, which is nearly impossible without massive social cost. The final element of the heir fee is perhaps the most important, and it's purely symbolic but no less powerful for that. The heir, having announced the inheritance, is sit in the deceased's high seat. This is the chair at the centre of the hall, the position of authority. And sitting in it means claiming leadership of the household and all the responsibilities that come with it. You don't get to inherit the wealth without inheriting the obligations maintaining the household, supporting dependents, honouring alliances, continuing the family's role in the community. The chair is a throne in miniature, and taking it is a declaration that you're ready to rule, even if your kingdom is just a farm and a few outbuildings. What makes this ritual brilliant is that it forces resolution of inheritance disputes at the moment when everyone is most motivated to resolve them peacefully. Grief is fresh. Violence would dishonour the recently dead. The entire community is present and watching. Fighting about inheritance at a funeral feast marks you as someone without honour, someone who values property over propriety, and that's a reputation that will follow you for life. So disputes that might otherwise lead to feuds or violence get negotiated, compromised, settled, all within the structure of a religious and social ritual that makes peace more appealing than conflict. It's social engineering disguised as ceremony, and it works. The frequency of earthy feasts, the elaborate nature of burials, the careful attention to grave goods and inheritance procedure, all of this points to something crucial about Viking society. Death isn't the end of social relationships. It's a transformation of them. The dead become ancestors, sources of luck and protection if properly honoured, sources of curses and misfortune if neglected. The living who inherit become stewards of memory and reputation, carrying forward the name and status of the dead. And the community that witnesses all this becomes the guarantor that the transition happens properly, that the social fabric repairs itself around the hole left by death. Which brings us to the final major ritual structure of Viking life, the one that ties together everything we've discussed so far. The ceremony that's simultaneously legal proceeding, religious observation, political theatre, and marketplace. The thing, once a year, sometimes more often if circumstances demand it, the free men of a region gather in a designated place that's been used for this purpose for generations, possibly centuries. This is the thing, and the name is deceptively simple for an institution this complex. It's a law assembly, yes, but it's also where chieftains are elected or deposed, where major disputes are settled, where trade happens, where marriages are arranged, where news from distant regions arrives and spreads. For the days or weeks it lasts, the Thing grounds become the political and social centre of Viking life, the place where a scattered, decentralised society briefly coalesces into something resembling a unified community. The location itself is significant, chosen for practical and spiritual reasons that blend together seamlessly. It needs to be accessible, flat enough for crowds to gather, near water and pasture for the animals people bring. But it also needs to be traditional, the same place used by previous generations, marked by standing stones or ancient mounds that connect this year's assembly to all the assemblies that came before. Some think sites are associated with specific gods or local spirits, adding a layer of sacredness to the proceedings. You're not just meeting in a field, you're meeting in a place where the divine and human worlds overlap, where oaths sworn have extra weight because the gods are assumed to be listening. The assembly begins formally, with the law speaker taking his position. This person, always a man in Viking society, has been elected specifically for his ability to memorize and recite law. There is no written legal code, no books to consult, no precedent anyone can look up. The law exists in the law speaker's memory, in the collective memory of the community, and it's transmitted orally from one generation to the next. The law speaker's job is to recite the relevant laws before cases are heard, to remind everyone of the rules they're operating under. And this recitation is itself a ritual act. He stands on a law rock, an elevated stone or mound that lets his voice carry, and he speaks the law into existence, making it real through repetition. Once the laws are spoken, the cases begin, and these are as much performance as legal proceeding. Someone stands to accuse another of a crime or breach of contract. The accused responds, either admitting guilt or denying charges. Witnesses are called, people who saw what happened or who can vouch for character. The community, all the free men gathered, listens and judges, not through formal vote but through general consensus that emerges from debate and discussion. There are no lawyers, no professional judges beyond the law speaker who only advises on law itself. Justice is communal, participatory, transparent. Everyone sees the argument, everyone hears the evidence, everyone has a voice if they're respected enough that others will listen. The penalties for wrongdoing reveal the Viking value system clearly. Most crimes, including murder, can be settled with compensation. If you kill someone, their family has the right to kill you, but they also have the right to accept wagi, blood money, a payment that's calculated based on the victim's social status and the circumstances of the death. This isn't because Viking society doesn't value life, it's because endless cycles of a revenge killing are bad for everyone, and creating a legal mechanism for ending feuds peacefully benefits the whole community. The person who accepts Wergild instead of vengeance is seen as reasonable, mature, someone who values peace and prosperity over emotional satisfaction. Refusing reasonable Wergild and insisting on blood revenge marks you as someone who prioritizes personal honor over community stability. And that's a reputation that costs you social capital. But there are crimes that can't be compensated. Violations so severe that blood money isn't enough. For these, the punishment is outlawry. The thing can declare someone outside the law, which means they lose all legal protection and rights. Anyone can kill an outlaw without consequence. No one can shelter them, trade with them, or help them without becoming implicated in their crimes. Outlawry is social death, exile from the only community you know, and it's reserved for the worst offences: oath-breaking, repeated serious crimes, violations of sacred law like murder at a thing or during a truce. It's both punishment and solution, removing dangerous individuals from society without the community having to directly execute them, letting the wilderness or their own bad decisions do the work instead. Between the formal legal cases, the thing becomes something else. Trading happens. Merchants setting up temporary stalls to sell goods from distant regions. Marriages are negotiated. Fathers and sons meeting to discuss terms for betrothals that will tie families together. Political alliances form and dissolve. Chieftains meeting privately to discuss who they'll support in upcoming elections or conflicts. Entertainment appears: travelling performers, storytellers, poets reciting skaldic verses about recent events or legendary heroes. Gambling happens, men playing dice or board games for money or goods. Drinking happens, inevitably. Mead and ale flowing as men who might see each other only once a year catch up on news and gossip. The thing is also where chieftains are elected or confirmed. And this process is fascinating because it's simultaneously democratic and hierarchical. The position isn't hereditary in the strict sense. You can't inherit leadership automatically. But it tends to stay within families because the son of a successful chieftain has advantages inherited wealth, established relationships, name recognition. When a chieftain dies or proves incompetent, the Thing can elect a replacement, and this election happens through a combination of formal nomination and informal consensus. Candidates are proposed, arguments are made for their qualifications, and eventually the assembly settles on someone who has enough support to lead effectively. The new chieftain then swears oaths to uphold the law and protect the community, binding himself to the position through witnessed promises that carry legal and spiritual weight. What's remarkable about the Thing system is how it manages to maintain social order across vast distances without a centralised state. Iceland, famously, had no king for most of the Viking Age. The Althing, the National Assembly, was the highest authority, and it governed through consensus and reputation rather than force. This worked because Viking society was built on honour, on the understanding that your reputation was your most valuable possession, and that losing it meant losing everything. Being known as Oathbreaker, as someone unreliable or dishonest, made you untradeable, unmarriageable, unable to get help when you needed it. The Thing was where reputations were made and destroyed, where public opinion crystallised into social fact, and where the threat of communal judgment was enough to keep most people mostly in line most of the time. The ritual elements of the Thing were woven throughout the practical business. Oaths were sworn on sacred rings, metal bands that had been consecrated to gods and that carried the weight of divine witness. Breaking an oath sworn on a sacred ring wasn't just a breach of contract, it was a religious offence that put you at odds with the gods themselves. Cases were often settled through formal oath-taking, where the accused could gather oath helpers, people who would swear to their innocence or character, and the number and quality of oath helpers you could muster reflected your social standing. If you couldn't find enough people willing to swear for you, the case was essentially decided before any evidence was heard. Duels were another option, trial by combat where the gods were assumed to favour the righteous party. These weren't common, they were expensive and dangerous, but they were available for disputes that couldn't be settled through testimony or compensation. The duel itself had strict rules, fought in a marked-off area with specific weapons, supervised by witnesses who ensured fairness. Winning a duel proved you were right not because you were stronger or more skilled, but because the gods had allowed you to win, confirming your version of events through divine intervention. The Thing lasted as long as necessary, sometimes just a few days for a local assembly, sometimes weeks for a regional or national gathering. When business was concluded, when cases were settled and elections held and trades completed, the assembly dissolved, everyone returning to their farms and villages until next year. But the effects lingered. Alliances made at the Thing shaped politics for months. Legal decisions set precedents that would be remembered and referenced at future assemblies. Marriages arranged would tie families together for generations. The Thing was temporary as event, but permanent as institution, the skeleton that held together a society that otherwise had no skeleton at all. And this, finally, is what all these rituals amount to. The morning grooming and weekly bathing that made Vikings cleaner than their European neighbours. The blot ceremonies that fed gods and consolidated political power. The cider practices that blurred magic and technology. The life cycle rituals that transformed biological events into legal facts. The funeral feasts that managed inheritance and prevented feuds. The Thing assemblies that governed through consensus and reputation. All of it together forms a complete social system. A way of organising human lives that doesn't require a state or a bureaucracy or a police force. Viking society worked because ritual gave structure to chaos, because repeated ceremonies created predictability, because everyone knew what was expected and what would happen if expectations weren't met. The rituals weren't decorative. They weren't superstitious remnants of a primitive past. They were functional technologies for maintaining order, for transferring knowledge, for resolving conflicts, for making decisions collectively. And they worked well enough that Viking culture spread across Europe. From Scandinavia to Britain to Iceland to Greenland to the edges of North America, a decentralised society expanding through trade and settlement, and yes, sometimes through violence, but always carrying with it these same rituals that made them Viking rather than merely Scandinavian. The stereotype of Vikings as chaotic barbarians, as raiders who destroyed civilization, misses the point so completely it's almost funny. Vikings were obsessively civilized, just in a different way than their Christian neighbours. They had structure, it just wasn't written down. They had law, it just wasn't enforced by judges and police. They had religion, it just wasn't about sin and salvation. They had hygiene standards. They were just different from Islamic ritual purity or Christian suspicion of bathing. Understanding Vikings means understanding that civilization takes many forms, that there's more than one way to organise a society, and that the daily rituals we often dismiss as trivial or superstitious are actually the load-bearing pillars holding everything up. So when you think of Vikings now, try to imagine this instead: a farmer who bathes every Saturday, who owns an elaborately carved comb he treats like jewellery, who attends the Thing every summer to vote on laws and settle disputes, who hosts or attends blot ceremonies to stay on good terms with gods and neighbours, who knows that his reputation is everything and that losing it would be worse than losing his farm. That farmer is more historically accurate than any horned helmet-wearing raider, and understanding his daily rituals tells you more about Viking civilization than 1,000 sagas about battles and conquests. The Longhouse fire is burning low now. Tomorrow it will be rebuilt, and the day will begin again with washing, grooming, the small rituals that mark you as civilized. The week will turn towards Saturday and another bath. The seasons will turn toward the next blot. Life will continue in its patterns, structured by ceremony, given meaning through repetition, made bearable through the knowledge that everyone else is following the same rules, honouring the same gods, maintaining the same standards. This is what daily life meant for Vikings. Not glory or violence, but routine, ritual, and the comfort of knowing your place in an ordered world. And that's what we often miss when we romanticise or demonise the past, when we turn historical peoples into cartoon versions of themselves. Real life, for Vikings as for everyone, it was mostly routine. Most days no one raided anything or discovered new lands or fought dramatic battles. Most days you woke up, washed your face, combed your hair, did your work, ate your meals, participated in whatever ceremonies your community required, and went to sleep planning to do it again tomorrow. The rituals that structured those ordinary days are what actually mattered, what actually defined the culture, what actually made Vikings into Vikings rather than just people who happened to live in Scandinavia during the Middle Ages. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, maybe think about your own rituals, the things you do every day without thinking about them, the routines that structure your time and give your life predictability. We're not so different from Vikings in that respect. We just use different tools, honour different gods or no gods, follow different customs. But the human need for structure, for routine, for ritual that transforms chaos into order, that's universal. That's what connects us across 1,000 years to people who would be utterly alien to us in some ways, and completely familiar in others. The fire burns down to embers. The longhouse settles into quiet. Tomorrow, the rituals begin again,